Vintage.
Okay. So we're live. Is this thing on? Hello. Oh, wow, that's really loud. Thank you very much for coming. If you're still coming in, there are seats, or you can sit on the floor if you're up to that. I know I'm not. And please take some time to admire the ceiling in this room. Wow. I'm thinking of having one of these painted in my living room. So this is a panel entitled Radical Change in the World Calls for Radical Changes in Journalism. So if that's not what you were hoping for, you're in the wrong room. But you're welcome to stay. So we have a very esteemed panel today. On my left is Alan Rusbridger. Next to him is Julia Angwin. And then, of course, Dan Gillmor. Dan sort of laid out the vision, if you will, of this panel, which I would like to read out. Around the world, including liberal democracies, journalism and journalists are under attack, but this is a symptom of a much deeper trend, a move away from the basic freedoms that were ascendant in the second half of the 20th century. Meanwhile, huge and nearly unaccountable technology companies, often with government collaboration, are taking control of communications. Doing journalistic business as usual isn't enough. So that's the statement that we would like to discuss. And Dan, could you start us off?
Yes. It is an amazing ceiling. Hard not to gaze upward as one speaks. I think it's clear to most of us who are in or near the journalism business that we're in a state of emergency around the world, one that's growing because of the trend that is unavoidable for us now, which is that we are the enemy for authoritarians and for others. But as Matthew noted there, I think we have to frame that in context of a meltdown of liberal democracy and the rise of authoritarianism and the fundamental attacks on norms and other things we've taken for granted for a long time. I come at this obviously from mostly an American perspective, but we only have to look around in Europe to see plenty of examples, and in other parts of the world as well. So that's one area I think is a key one. In the US where I live, I've watched journalists fail in an amazing way to rise to the situation. And I don't understand it. I do understand that journalists themselves have norms and that that's playing a big role. But this is one of these existential threats that we face. I happen to believe in liberal democracy. There are others in my country who believe in returning the American culture and economy to maybe around the 1890s, and are working very hard to do that. I don't see the journalists as a group talking about this. I don't see journalists saying to the public, something profound is happening, and we have to deal with it. And this is in just one of the areas where I think that there's a failure of journalism to look at something that is massive and to put it on the public agenda in a way that cannot be ignored. Another one is climate change, which is, again, difficult for journalists for some reason to say, well, this has to be not just something we write about sporadically, periodically, but we have to put it in the face of the public in a major way. And I think there are 2 or 3 overriding issues in the world like that. So when I say that we have to do some radical change faced by these things. And Julia can talk about, I hope you'll talk about the technology trends that are also quite epic and things that we are not spending a lot of time on in journalism while we focus on demanding that Facebook and Google be the editors of the internet. That's sort of part of the problem. But let me just talk a little bit about the political and cultural and economic one. And this is when I say this to people, they say, well, what do you want us to do? So here's what I want journalists to do, and I think this applies in other countries, not everywhere, but could be done. I would like to see my friends in the journalism business in the United States, and certainly Western Europe, think of this as an emergency and deal with it as such, as a craft, as a profession, as an industry, and say, we will put this in context, and we will do it in every single possible way we can, and we will do it together, and we will put it in the face of the public in a way that cannot be ignored, and that will be understood as something quite large, of which Trump's latest tweet is simply the tiniest symptom. One little piece. Instead of chasing shiny objects day by day by day by day, and usually catching them, and doing nothing to help us understand the overwhelming attack on norms, laws, the environment, and various other things that's going on. So how would I work? How would I do it? Well, there's some models in the past that I think would be hard to replicate precisely, and maybe not the right way to do it, but collaborate. Collaborate in every possible way. In the US, in the 1970s, a journalist in Phoenix, Arizona was assassinated by the mafia. And the journalists, investigative journalists around the country, got on planes, dozens of them, and went to Phoenix and worked on a project together that would appear in all of their publications, or nearly all. That's an example, and the International Consortium now for Investigative Journalism is another example. But I'd like to see this done in a way that says, here is this immense thing that's happening to us, and on climate change in the same sense, and that where journalists work together across organizations and not try to compete for all the same stories, but compete with and for each other, maybe on the edges, and local news organizations certainly can get their own piece of it, but then put it all together for people and have it be a constant feature on the homepage, in the social media that they're using, and otherwise. Put this entire thing into context and make it unavoidable for the public to understand. That to me would be a public service of just enormous value. And I hope that people would think about doing it. I'll stop there, and we'll go.
Julia, do you want to, what's your perspective on this problem?
Sure. I agree that calling it an emergency is probably the right term. I would put, I'd like to diagnose that emergency a little bit more.
Sure.
So the way I see it is we have a financial emergency and a sort of technological emergency. So on the financial side of things, most journalistic operations had kind of local monopolies that they've lost, and largely they've lost those to Google and Facebook, who've taken most of the money out of the market. Basically, journalism, those monopolies were based on your audience. So when I worked for 14 years at the Wall Street Journal, the reason they could charge so much money for an ad is because if you wanted to reach a guy who was a businessman who golfed and had a Mercedes, probably the best way to get him was through the Wall Street Journal. Then what happened is we invented online ad tracking. And now you can find a guy with a Mercedes who's a business executive who golfs simply by following that person around the internet and developing a profile of their behavior, which is what Google and Facebook and all these other online ad companies do. And you can target them at a moment that is much more opportune, right? They might be really engrossed in this article on the Wall Street Journal, so they might not notice the advertising. They're more likely to notice the advertising on some website they're not as interested in. So weirdly, the ads moved to lower quality places, and they got the same audience. So essentially, journalism lost its monopoly on the audience because we allowed this sort of surveillance capitalism to arise, unrestricted and unchecked. And so I think that it's important to note why we're in a financial emergency is because of that. Then we're in sort of a technological emergency, which is that I believe that one reason that we're seeing a rise of totalitarianism and authoritarian governments is because the tools to enforce authoritarianism and totalitarianism have never been better, right? The ability to survey all your citizens and monitor their every move and actually bombard them with propaganda is a dictator's dream. And that's what we've created with our global communications medium. And so it makes perfect sense that when you have the rise of these tools for totalitarianism, that opportunistic governments would come in and seize those tools and start using them. And really the only controls we have on that are Google and Facebook. Citizens around the world basically are begging these countries to rein in propaganda and hate speech and things that they would normally ask their government of. But the global communications medium is bigger than any government, and really it's up to Google and Facebook and Twitter to decide what kind of speech they're going to allow. They regulate discourse around the world, political speech, actual friendship speech, how we communicate with our loved ones. They are our global speech governors. And they aren't regulated. So this is kind of a perfect storm of the journalists the bottom has fallen out, they're totally unfunded, crippled, and then there's this rise of a new kind of the totalitarian regimes plus these global giants, neither of whom can be adequately policed by the journalists. And so it feels like an emergency. I'm not sure I have a solution, but I feel like I have a handle on the problem.
Well, we're going to come up with one in this session. So, Alan, thoughts?
Well, one of the great reliefs, I think, of this year's discussions at Perugia, and I think maybe more generally, is that it was really depressing for about the last 10 years that whenever you tried to discuss journalism and the way journalism needed to change, the first question was always about the business model. Somebody would say, yeah, but what's your view on paywalls? And I think we're having a slightly maturer discussion now, and it seems, I think the penny is dropping that unless you can sort out what you think you're doing as a journalist, or maybe what even journalism is, the idea of getting the public to pay for it is a secondary issue. And I'm more and more convinced, and having just written a book about all this, the most basic, we have to start with the most basic questions about what we do, because what we used to do was tailored to a previous kind of technology and a previous structures of the way that societies arrange themselves and people in authority arrange themselves, and within the last 12 years that's all gone. A society that used to be arranged vertically, in the case of news, we used to almost literally hand it down to people and they would hand their money up to us, but not just news is now operating on a horizontal level. And yet an awful lot of journalists don't want to have that discussion. And of course they want to hanker for the way that things were arranged, because that was really nice if you were a journalist. It really was.
It was pretty great.
It was great.
For some people.
Yeah.
For some people. So I think, for me, everything boils down to the word public. Can we agree on a public interest? Can we define a public interest? What public interest is it that we serve? Are we a public service? Is journalism a form of service to the public? If so, do we ever talk to them about what they want? Journalism is not going to survive without the support of the public, whether that is financial or just simply in defending journalists against the forces who want to crush journalism. So we have to have the public on our side. And if you can answer those sort of first-order questions, then you can, I think, begin to think, well, how is that going to be funded? I think we don't think enough about journalism as a public service, because in the past, most of the models of journalism were aimed at pleasing shareholders or proprietors. So you were really editing for a business model, and I think if you edit for a business model or you edit for a public service, you're going to edit in two different kinds of ways. Dan's mentioned climate change. It may not be a very good business model to write about climate change. It may be that readers don't want to read about it, and your metrics may tell you not to write about climate change because you want lots of subscriptions. So you could not write about climate change and have a brilliant business model. That would be catastrophic for the planet, because we are going to need our politicians to make some tough choices on our behalf in the next very short period. And if the public haven't been prepared in any way, or still worse, have been told this is all rubbish, or there's a complete absence of coverage, that's a democratic catastrophe. But that is absolutely in the public interest. And I'll just end with a couple of things. Where does that lead the conversation about the business model? Well, on The Guardian, it turned out that the members, the public, the readers, were much more interested in supporting The Guardian's journalism so that it could be read by everybody. They didn't want to buy it as a public good. They wanted to buy it as a private good. They wanted to buy it as a public good. And I think they wouldn't do that unless they recognized something in The Guardian's journalism that answered the questions. So all the money that we ploughed into investigations, into Snowden, into WikiLeaks, into phone hacking, into tax dodging, into torture and rendition, each individually did not please the financial controllers, but it turned out that was the business model because the public recognized something of a public service there. And finally, if it turns out that the market can't support what the public needs, then we have to think very radically about how we then sustain journalism. And that might be reinventing categories of businesses, of companies that have got nothing to do with shareholder profit or filling the boots of proprietors or whoever, but is about a public benefit. So how can we start thinking of public benefit companies that would have this public service at the heart of their mission, and we can then work out how to incentivize them to produce journalism which the public wants, will defend, and needs.
So it seems to me as though we're looking at sort of two obviously related problems. One is, and you and I, Alan, spoke about this a little bit, if we ask the tech companies to save journalism, their response is, well, what exactly do you want us to save? What is the journalism that you think we should help support? What does it look like? Is it just anything that journalistic entities produce? And to your point, we have sort of different varieties of journalism. There's journalism that appears to be done just so people will click and ad revenue will flow towards the company. Is that the kind of journalism that we need at this time? And if the type of journalism that we need is a different type, how do we fund it? How is it supported? And how do we convince people who clearly need something that we're the ones who are going to provide that? I mean, I don't have answers to these questions.
Well, I think that is a huge problem because we don't frame ourselves as I mean, we of course we use the language of we tell truth to power and so on and so forth, but we don't really frame ourselves as a public service in the sense that I think the public would recognize. And so you, especially, I mean, I did a talk in Singapore recently to extremely bright scholars at Singapore National University, and one of them said, but you've got to admit that Daily Mail is a better, more successful, more profitable newspaper than The Guardian. So I said, well, let's get the Daily Mail up. And so somebody got it up on their tabloid, on their computer. And I said, just read out the headline. And the headline was, I get all the Mel's, there was a Mel B was in love with Mel C, or is that the story? Anyway, one of the Mels was in love with another of the Mels, and that was right across the front page of the Mail, and then that was before you even got to the sidebar of shame, with numerous B-list starlets flaunting their whatever on beaches. And I said, okay, so that makes more money, that has a big audience, it's more successful, but is it better? Is that what society needs? But the fact that even these really clever students hadn't really sort of thought about the link between what journalism at its best can do and the health of a democracy. So, even the smartest students, so we've got a big job of education to do.
So that goes to sort of my point, and Dan, I wanted to ask you about this. How do we convince, so if there is an emergency, how do we, sort of convince people that there is an emergency, that there's a fire, and how do we convince them that we are the ones who can put it out, or that they should trust us to do that?
Well, I'm not at all interested in saving traditional journalism companies. I'm desperately interested in saving journalism at whatever economic construct we arrive at. But I think I liked the part of staying away from the business model issue until we've solved the why are we doing this issue. I think there are a lot of things that have not been tried on business models, but I don't want to go off into the weeds on this. I think the emergency that the things that we have to persuade people of now are just epic in size, and we're not doing it. And it bothers me. And Julia, you said you weren't sure what journalists should do about things like control of freedom of expression being sucked into the hands of governments and a few companies. Well, one thing is we can make it one of the paramount issues that we deal with as journalists. We can tell people what's going on. We can tell people that contrary to the accepted wisdom, there is a whole group of young, brilliant people in Silicon Valley and other places working on ways to re-decentralize the internet that might really work. There's so much we can do that I just despair that it's not being done.
Julia?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, to your point, Dan, I would say that's why I'm starting a new newsroom that literally is going to focus entirely on the impact of technology on society. And the stories that I just told you, which is that we're moving towards turnkey totalitarianism, that the tech companies are global governors of speech and have taken all the money from journalism, are obviously really important impacts of technology on society that we're going to write about and investigate. But I want to say something that's a little bit provocative, which is, okay, let's say journalism, it's a fire, right? I don't think we have adequately trained or convinced the public, and I actually don't think we are adequately capable of arguing that we are trained firefighters. The truth is that journalism is a profession that has no credentials. You can get thrown out of being a lawyer, you can get disbarred, right? You can get thrown out of the medical profession. You literally can't get thrown out of journalism. And it's a really controversial thing to say at a journalism conference, but like, now that we've decentralized the ability to witness and publish, anyone can call themselves a journalist, and that's a good thing because they are witnessing and publishing, and that's an important role. But perhaps it might be time to draw some lines ourselves about who we consider a journalist. And I would just throw out there this one idea, which is, what if your news outlet has been debunked in Snopes or any of the other places, perhaps you shouldn't make the cut, right? Like, we could set that bar. You know, I'm not saying I would never argue for government credentialing of journalists, but I can see a world where we have peer accreditation for institutions that meet certain threshold of accuracy. And I think that could reestablish some trust in journalism, honestly. And it's a totally controversial thing to say, but it's something to think about.
Any thoughts, Alan?
Well, I think it is interesting because if you're let's say let's go with this idea of a public benefit company, and you're going to give some kind of incentives to this in order to supply the news that we can agree society needs. Society can't operate if we can't say, well, this is a fact, that's not a fact, this is true, that's not true. Society can't work, science can't work, academia can't work, law can't work. So we can probably convince the public that we do need that basis of fact, which I think people are really frightened about at the moment. And then we might ask what kind of news they want, which might be different from what historically we have given them. And then I think that's obviously right, that we then have to, that you would have to meet a certain bar of accuracy and ethical behavior in order to qualify for whatever incentive you wanted to give. But I mean, in a sense, we do some of that already. The most trusted news organization in the UK is the BBC, which is effectively financed by a form of taxation and has to meet certain standards of impartiality and accuracy and ethical behavior, and if they don't, they're in trouble. So we've got models for how we might do that. I think it gets more tricky with individual journalists and the credentialing of individual journalists, because that's almost like a sort of license to be a journalist. And you know, Milton and others fought 300 years ago to get rid of licensing, and I can't imagine going back to it.
Of course, Italy has journalistic licensing.
Oh, it does.
Just point that out.
I mean, I would argue, I'm only arguing for it on the institutional level, and I'm not even sure I'm arguing for it. I just think, I'll tell you why I think this way, because the rise of disinformation is a real problem, right? Misinformation, disinformation, the decentralization of the creation of propaganda means anyone can spread any lie. And the tech platforms really don't want to have to make the decision themselves. And I think that is honestly sort of, we also don't want them to make that decision, right? And so if you think about misinformation as spam, just as a person who's a tech reporter and a technologist, like the spam problem we basically solved, and we solved it a very simple way. We had a law, the Can Spam Act in the United States, that gave liability to people who allowed their platform to be used to spread spam. Then what that meant was that law also gave safe harbor to those people so they could create a blacklist together. So all the email platforms came together and created a blacklist, a shared list of who were the bad actors. And then on top of that, many of them came up with whitelists of good actors, right? So email senders could win their way onto the whitelist. And actually, that combination of strict liability combined with industry-wide coordination pretty much solved the problem, right? And honestly, the tech companies right now would be so happy if somebody would give them a blacklist and a whitelist, but they're never going to spend the money if they don't have liability, right? And so I just see it from a completely technical standpoint, that it's a solvable problem, but it would mean a whole bunch of things would have to change. One is the tech companies would have to have liability for their actions, which they don't. They have immunity under the law because we've passed in the 1996 Telecom Act.
Right, 230.
A Section 230 law, which is basically that they don't have any liability for anything written on their platforms. That's not necessarily true in Europe, right? In Germany in particular, the tech platforms actually have a lot of liability under the law. But I just think that from a technical standpoint, some of these things are solvable, but they also would require journalists to be ranked in some way. And I feel like if we're going to rank journalists, we should do it ourselves and not let anyone else do it.
So, I mean, my fear, I don't know about you, but my fear is that we've already seen countries implementing fake news laws and misinformation laws, and what they're really doing is cracking down on speech that they dislike. And so it's a great tool for them to use to say, we're cracking down on misinformation, when really what they're doing is trying to stop people saying things that they don't like.
That is true.
I'm conscious that there's probably questions, at least I hope so. Do we have a microphone? Yep. So please put your hand up, or wave, or jump up and down, or does anybody have one? Yeah, up front. And if you could just say who you are,
yes,
if you don't mind.
My name is Isabel Cuesta. I'm a freelance journalist. I've been hearing throughout these days here in the festival about on the one side, the problem with Facebook, because it has so much power, and then if it should be regulated or not. And I mean, questions around that, and now like the risk of journalism was the next step for the future. And I've been wondering when listening to these panels if we are not biting our tail, because we gave that amount of power to Facebook. And I wonder, it's just like an idea, and I would like to hear if someone has a comment about that. Because these companies started by one individual, and it became so big because society played by his rules. So instead of asking if now journalism or like the state should do something, if it shouldn't come out from the people, like all of us, if we should try as journalists to kind of to hold this big institution onto account more strongly, and on the other hand, if it could be, because Alan, you mentioned about maybe public benefit companies that would be interested in giving finance to journalism, if we could steer the discussion to maybe wake up people to maybe make a stand towards Facebook in a different way, so that it's not only journalism holding to account this big company, but society as a collective holding account what is happening to all of us, because also what it seems to me is that nobody knows what was going to happen, and nobody really knows what's happening, and nobody really knows how all this technology actually functions.
Anybody want to?
Well, I mean, I guess I would just say, like, I'm starting a new newsroom that's almost entirely devoted to that issue. So it's called the Markup. We're going to be launching hopefully this summer, start publishing, and our goal is to hold technology to account, and we have a newsroom that's half programmers and half journalists, because many of our investigations are technical in nature, and so we plan to use technology to help hold technology to account. And so I agree with you that, like, our goal is really to educate people about what is happening, and so much of what happens with technology is the companies make it sound really complicated, and everyone gets confused about whether anything bad is happening. And so we want to explain what's going on in the simplest of terms, but we also actually, to do that, need to understand very precisely what's going on.
Yeah.
Taha Siddiqui, I'm a Pakistani journalist based out of Paris. I just wanted to know, basically going back to the whole idea of public service, and many a times, because Pakistan has a big problem of attacks against journalists, I went through something similar. And many a times then when we try to get back, and a lot of journalists from our own community, especially in Pakistan, or for example, senior journalists would say that what you're doing is activism rather than journalism. And then a lot of people would like sort of say, okay, this is a line you're crossing. But as you know, there's an emergency in the world, as was mentioned earlier. So I would like your thoughts of the panel here, that how do you protect yourself from still being a journalist and still doing this because we need to advocate and we need to do this. And so this is a dilemma for me personally also, that many a times when I'm doing this, they're like, but this is activism, this is not journalism.
That's a great point. And I know that Dan in particular has thoughts about that, journalists as activists.
I think if journalists are not activists on at least some topics, including the attacks on basic freedoms and liberties in the Western world especially, but around the world, that are new, that are basically going to make journalism impossible. If we're not activists in opposing that and doing other things, why are we calling ourselves journalists? We have to be activists.
We have to be activists for the truth, right? Like, I think that's really what we should be activists for.
I think that's not enough. I think activism in saving, look, we talk about journalism on fire. The world is on fire. I think this is bigger. And maybe this is going to be, maybe if people did what I want them to do, it would destroy journalism. And maybe, I'm willing to take that risk. But we're going to be destroyed if we continue down the path we're on. We will be, and our liberties and our fundamental value systems are up for grabs right now.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Ceylette Dreyfus from the University of Melbourne in Australia. I have a question for the panel. If we think of news as a public good, I'm interested to see what lessons you all think we could draw from this industry, from healthcare, from education, and from the deregulation of telecommunications.
Good question.
I'll have a bash at education because I have a foot in that world now. It's very interesting that this question of why do journalists have such lamentable standards of trust? Why at a time when we're so convinced that the world needs what we can give it, people are not convinced? And I think there are things that academics do, which is essentially not take it for granted that you're going to believe what I write. So we use footnotes, and so that you can completely verify anything I write by my sources. And journalists are terribly, I find it infuriating in 2019 that journalists still haven't learned what a link is. To link to the original document or to a source, and the persistent use of anonymous sources or not even bothering to use sources at all. Well, why should we trust them anymore? And I think in my use of Twitter, where I find people much more inclined to adduce evidence and to provide links and to cite reports or use screenshots, and to respond if people challenge and to correct things immediately. Those are ways of building trust, and some of them come out of the world of academia.
Let me just add, one thing we don't do in journalism, which we should do, and I hope we'll start to do more of, is help the public that we are serving understand how journalism works through transparency and engaging people in the public in the process of journalism more. And into the specific of healthcare, this is one of the things that it's everywhere now. We can't, when you said deregulating communications in health, I'm kind of worried about regulating communications as long as we have an educated public. And that's the part journalists need to work on more in that particular thing. It's a project we're doing, as you know.
I think definitely this is not an answer to your question, I'm afraid, but more recognition that your question is an important one. I mean, education, the things that people argue about are education about what? What are we educating people about? And there's a lot of debate about things that are appropriate or not appropriate. And so journalism, I think one of the things we have to wrestle with is not just what journalism is, but what is it about? And we have to be prepared to defend what it is our journalism is about. And some of it, to be honest, is not that defensible. So that's a problem. Was there a question at the back? No?
In the front.
Yes?
In the front.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you. My name is Gillmor. I'm also from Pakistan. I'm a columnist and an activist. This problem that Alan spoke about, read the Daily Mail, Mel A versus Mel B.
Which is an important issue.
Yes, it is. But really, is it to some extent maybe an idea for journalists who want to do public interest journalism begin to really badger down on the difference between public interest and entertainment, because that really is entertainment, to start really positioning yourself differently and somehow drawing that classification. And the other question is, would it be stupid to even begin thinking about, here are journalists holding themselves responsible for holding governments, dictatorships, fascist democracies, other democracies, tech companies, tech giants responsible, as you were talking about trying to do that with tech giants. Nobody's thinking about holding the audience responsible at all. They're being treated, the audience at large is treated like children. Do you know what I mean? There seems to be, like you said, on Twitter, people are a lot more savvy. They'll do away with fake news rather quickly. They'll respond, they'll come up with links or whatever. So there is a savvy audience. And then there's all the rest of the world that we do not hold responsible for gulping down anything that comes their way. Is there a way we can think about putting some responsibility on the consumers?
Yes.
Good question.
Absolutely. I think knowing the difference between truth and falsehood, or at least how to find it, is something that we as humans, as opposed to journalists, should be requiring ourselves to do. We have to take more responsibility in a world of unlimited, essentially unlimited information, and equally important, the ability for anyone to create information and put it out on public networks for anyone else to see. That invariably, inevitably requires some taking responsibility on our parts. When we ask others to do something, we're asking them to control what we can do, and that's very dangerous.
I think
I think honestly, there's been a little bit of a flowering in the past few years of what we're calling in the U.S. engagement journalism, where people newsrooms are reaching out to their audiences, asking to enlist them in their investigations. And it's actually been so amazing for me to watch, because at the Wall Street Journal, it was just like, I don't know who those people are. They buy it, never talk to them, right?
Be quiet and read.
Yeah. But at ProPublica, when I was there, it was amazing that the audience really wanted to help. And one of the things I started doing more frequently was building tools for our audience to use that would help them then donate data to us that we could use. And it was a really virtuous cycle, and we got amazing stories out of it. So I think there is a movement towards that, and I think it's an amazing one. I think a lot of newsrooms are worried because what they really want from their audience is money, and so it feels like a little bit of a tension, but I think that they probably go hand in hand, right? Like that the more people are engaged with you, the more likely they are to donate. But I think I actually have a lot of hope for that field.
That's a really great point. I think if you if you expect nothing of your readers other than just to read and shut up, then that's what you'll get. And but I think if ProPublica in particular has shown that if you say, can you help us do something, it is important, we think you have things to contribute, that you will get people helping. And then instead of sort of us, we will fix it, or we will tell you what's important, or we will, why not, you know, do it together. Was there another question back here? I thought I saw a hand, no?
Just to add to that point on I mean, the traditional argument for great journalism was that we created better informed citizens, and citizens wanted to be better informed because they would then make better democratic choices and we would have better government. That's the whole sort of Walter Lippmann, John Dewey argument. We're cut to Brexit. So we did a really bad job of informing the citizens, and we've got into a horrendous mess and politics and a complete failure of politics. So I can see now a generation of people would think, well, I was told that I should make myself better informed because we'd get better politics. I don't feel that politics has got anything to do with me at all, or that I can play any part in, or that anyone is interested in listening to what I'm doing. And so I think you're getting a severance. And I think you're right, we shouldn't let the public off the hook. But nevertheless, the problem is bigger than journalism. The problem is a failure of politics.
And sure. Hang on.
Again, you held yourself responsible for not informing the public well enough. I think there was a deluge of great information out there. There is a problem which lies outside of journalism. It has to do with people's emotions. It has to do with their historical experiences. It has to do with their prejudices. And I don't know, primordial responses or something. I mean, there is a problem somewhere else as well. There is a problem, I think, of, I don't know if it's judgmental to say that it's the same piece of information coming into the same family of siblings who have had the same family background and possibly have gone to the same schools, but both of them will process it differently. And in my judgmental sort of diction, I would say, some are critical thinkers, others are not. You're getting the same amount of information, the same type of information, and you're responding to it completely differently. And I do not know what it is that makes two people of fairly similar backgrounds and educational levels respond differently to it. One questions, the other does not. And one loves it, one hates it. You know, it's not just that you have failed at educating the public or informing the public. I mean, I followed that whole thing through.
Does that make you feel better?
I'm not trying to.
I mean, there are clearly problems that journalism can't
there.
solve. I mean, those are things that journalism fundamentally can't change.
No, it can't.
Yeah.
But it needs to recognize that there is also something else happening.
But you say the public was deluged with good information. Well,
were they?
Yeah, there was some. But you know, back to this question: well, what is journalism? Is journalism publishing 100 front pages telling people to vote Brexit and that immigrants are horrible? Because that's my opinion and that's the way that I want you to vote, and I'm not going to trouble you with the other side because, in my view, there isn't another side. Is that journalism? You're shaking your head, but that's what most British newspapers did. And we're asking the public to support journalism and come to this thing called journalism, this craft that has no credentials, where most of what we're producing, we might agree in this room, is not what we would think of as journalism. So no wonder the public is confused.
Yeah, very simply, I think if we just cut down to one very small thing, journalism would not be telling the public which way to vote, but to tell them whether that 200 million pounds will actually go into the NHS or not, and leave it at that.
Right. Yeah. But that's a great point. Dan, I wanted to ask you, was there a question? Okay. We are just about out of time, so.
I'll try and make it very quick.
Okay.
So my name's Alex. I'm a trainee with Deutsche Welle. Alan just sort of said that, part of what the problem with some of the newspapers is that you don't get the other side, which would kind of imply that maybe we do need to give two sides to a debate. But how much is journalism hobbling itself at the moment by trying to provide two sides to a debate when you've got one side that is either willing to tell downright lies or is just a lot less informed than, say, the expert who's on the other side of the table on a panel TV discussion?
So that's a great question. Jay Rosen has talked about the sort of false balance approach and the view from nowhere. And it does feel as though maybe some journalists feel as though they need to get another side even when there isn't another side.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah.
So I'm on a little bit of a jihad against objectivity. I think it's a false god, and it has led us to false equivalence. And
Totally agree.
And so I'm advocating that journalists should take the approach of modeling themselves after the scientific method, which basically means you have a hypothesis, and then you test that hypothesis. So the hypothesis might be, is Brexit going to contribute the dollars that that the proponents say it's going to contribute? And then the evidence would be, well, 99% of the data suggests no, it will not contribute that data, right? And then you would say, the next thing you would say is like, but the limitations of our study is that this is hypothetical, it hasn't happened yet, and there's a small chance that perhaps it would contribute 1/8 of that amount, or whatever the limitation would be. And that's what science does. And I think journalism can do that too. And we don't have to have two sides. We can just say 99% of the data says climate change is happening, but 1% says maybe it's not happening that much.
There's never two